Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I am continuing in this wonderful book by Martha Sweezy, Internal Family Systems for Shame and Guilt. And in today's illustration, it's a vignette about a relationship between an exile and these very harsh kind of inner critics. And it's interesting because when we think of a protector, we often think, oh, it's trying to protect this vulnerable exile underneath, right? But protectors can also be very mean in their strategy. And remember that they're also quite young, and they pick up the tactics used by parents, teachers, etc., right? So shaming, blaming, criticizing can often be used to try to get people to get in line socially or do the right thing. And so these young parts think that they're protecting the exile while also really hurting them. So, all right. So this is a client of Martha's named Etienne. Etienne, a 50-year-old cisgender, heterosexual, married French-Canadian immigrant to the United States, had some polarized protectors, the most dominant being a team of critics and a firefighter who looked at pornography. But he was currently focused on the relationship between some older boys who were protectors and a younger boy who was in exile. So again, these are kind of older boy parts inside of him. Etienne had grown up with 4 older brothers, and he had 3 grown sons. When he was 10 years old, his eldest brother died in a tractor accident. His mother became depressed and committed suicide a few years later. Oh my goodness. By the time of this session, he had been in therapy for 2 years. So a lot of tragedy and trauma in his past, a lot of male energy, looks like. So Etienne comes in and says, I have to get up in stages. I wake up shaking and I sit in a chair in the bedroom for a while before I can go downstairs. Martha says, is the shaking part the one that we talked to last week? And Etienne nods. She says, he doesn't protect anyone, right? So she's trying to get at the fact that he's in exile. He doesn't protect anyone, then he's in exile. Etienne says, yes. And the other parts all think that he ruins my life. They hate him. So a lot of times exiles are actually hated by their own protectors because the protectors sometimes are not even protecting the exile. They're protecting the system as a whole from the exile, who they think is their enemy. That, you can have polarizations between a manager and a firefighter, but you can also have polarizations between a protector and an exile who just really, really hates the panic or the grief or the overwhelming anger that the exile brings into the system. So they're saying, I hate this part. The older parts all think he ruins my life. They hate him. So he's aware of his parts. That's great. Martha says, would they hate him if you could help him? Great question. This is always what you're trying to offer to polarized parts that say, I hate them. Well, what if the self could help them so they didn't have to be so extreme? Would you then have to hate them? And usually they'll say no. Let's see what they say. Yeah, they say he's a hopeless embarrassment. They want him to go away forever. So they don't think that he can be helped, is I think what they're saying. And Martha says, Etienne, how do you feel toward them? Etienne shakes his head and sighs. He says, they're too harsh. She says, do they notice you? He says, they do now. She says, how do they respond to you? He says, they get quiet and they look embarrassed. And Martha says, they're older boys, right? And Etienne nods. How do you feel toward them? So she's continuing to try to assess if he's in self or not. He says, I want them to let me help him, meaning the one that they hate so much. And she says, will they? He says, they get so frustrated and angry. And so Martha reflects back, the harder they push, the worse he feels. Do they notice that? Etienne nods. That's good. So would they be willing to try something new? She asks. Etienne says, yeah, okay, but it will be hard for them. So this is interesting. It seems like Martha really trusts quite a bit in Etienne's self. He's aware of these parts. He's relating to them. He recognizes how much they dislike this other part. He wants them to know he can help that part, but they're having a really hard time, right? And so then Martha points out, this can be, helpful to just ask, does this part see, particularly with critics, how what they're doing doesn't achieve what they want? And again, these are young parts. They're doing the best that they know how. That was often modeled to them by caregivers and teachers. Shame, criticize, threaten. That's how I get people to do what I want, right? But it's not effective because it just makes the exile more and more volatile, which is what they don't want. So they often feel really frustrated. They can see that what they're doing isn't working. They just don't have anything new or anything. They don't know anything better. So Martha's offering an alternative. What if they were willing to try something new? And they say it would be hard. And so she says, what will be hard? Etienne says, they're just so used to doing this. Yeah. Martha says, but they don't do it because they're used to doing it. They're doing it because they're scared of his feelings. That reason would go away, though, if they let you help him. Then they would be able to do whatever they want. Yeah, this is really interesting. She's pretty confident with them, right? Because sometimes parts will say, this is all I know how to do. This is a habit. Sometimes it kind of can be. And even after they're unburdened, you can go back to them and say, oh, hey, remember, you don't have to do this anymore. And they go, oh, yeah, you're right. But she's being pretty confident. Like, you're not doing it because this is what you've always done. You're doing it because you're so afraid of this exile overwhelming the system. You're afraid of his feelings. That is the number one fear of big protectors, is that the overwhelming feelings of the exile will take over the system. And she may have had enough experience with this set of protectors in exile to know that to be true. So she offers them, what if they could do whatever they want instead? If yourself could help the exile, what would they like to do? And Etienne shrugs and says, they don't know. And Martha says, they can think about that. What are they afraid would happen if they stopped harassing the boy? And Etienne says, I would be him, which again is this fear of the exile's overwhelming feelings just completely taking over. So Martha says, he would take over? And Etienne nods. She says, that wouldn't be good for anyone, but we could talk to him about not taking over. Etienne says he doesn't like being controlled, which is very true of many of our exiles. They don't want to be controlled because that's what these inner parentified children parts that are criticizing them and bossing them around do to them all the time. They want freedom. And so Martha says, of course. And Etienne says he doesn't want anyone telling him what to do. And Martha says, how do you feel toward him, this exile? And Etienne says, I love him. Oh, sounds like self. So Martha says, can he hear you? And Etienne nods. Would he like to be with you now? Etienne says, he just wants to be with me without being told what to do. So Martha says, do that. Be with him. Don't tell him what to do. and ask the older boys if they can trust you, right? So the exile is so used to being bossed around, told what to do, criticized by this group of older boy critics. And so if he hasn't had experience with, or much experience with the self yet, he's going to assume that the self is going to be like these older boys. So there's this negotiation to get the older boys to trust the self, to go to the exile. So there's kind of an experiment there. Can you let me go and just see what happens if it's helpful to you? And then an experiment with the exile. Can you let me be with you so that you can see that I'm not going to boss you around or criticize you? Because of course the self would not do that. So the last note that Martha has is when Etienne looked inside, he found a quaking, shamed boy who was being persecuted by older boys. As this boy did not protect anyone else, he was in exile. The older boys were his protectors, not because they were kind. Protectors can be kind or mean, but because their intent was protective. They wanted Etienne to forget the past and go forward despite all obstacles. They did not want the boy's bewilderment, grief, dread, and shamefulness to stunt Etienne's life. Yeah, and remembering Etienne's history, it makes sense that he has parts that hold really intense bewilderment, grief, dread, shamefulness, right? So it makes sense that these protectors are afraid of that. So despite opposition from the older boys and the exile, I kept this session flowing in a couple of ways. First, I asked the older boys to notice Etienne's self, and then I suggested that the exile could be with Etienne's self rather than taking over. Hearing the suggestion as an attempt to control him, the exile balked at first, but because he did want to be with Etienne's self, he was finally willing to dial his feelings down a bit. And that's really all any part ever really wants, is to be seen and heard and valued and loved and just have withness, loving withness. And so as soon as our exiles really know that that's the intent of self, they will agree to not flood and overwhelm the system. Usually, again, they're coming up because they're trying to project it out to get that attention from someone outside of us, which doesn't often work either. And they just feel more and more desperate. And they're pushing against the critics and the manager parts that are trying so hard to push them down. There's this equal and opposite resistance. So when they do break into the surface, they explode and overwhelm the system. But as soon as they truly understand that the self loves them and can handle their big emotions and wants to be with them, they take a sigh of relief, and that's all they want. That's all they want is a loving presence. So let me know if you relate to any of Etienne's parts, or if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below.